When he returned to Capernaum, after some days, it was reported that he was at home. So many gathered around that there was no longer room for them, not even in front of the door. And he was speaking the word to them. Then some people came, bringing to him a paralyzed man, carried by 4 of them. And when they could not bring him to Jesus because of the crowd, they removed the roof above him. And after having dug through it, they let down the mat on which the paralytic lay. When Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralytic, "Child, your sins are forgiven." Now, some of the scribes were sitting there, questioning in their hearts, "Why does this fellow speak in this way? It is blasphemy. Who can forgive sins but God alone?" At once, Jesus perceived in his spirit that they were discussing these questions among themselves, and he said to them, "Why do you raise such questions in your hearts? Which is easier, to say to the paralytic, 'Your sins are forgiven,' or to say, 'Stand up and take your mat and walk'? But so that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins," he said to the paralytic, "I say to you, stand up, take your mat, and go to your home." And he stood up, and immediately took the mat, and went out before all of them, so that they were all amazed, and glorified God, saying, "We have never seen anything like this." You know, I always thought I knew what was going on in that story. It was one of those stories in the Bible that made for a perfect little children's story. And I don't think I really listened to it after childhood. The first time I heard that story, I remember being told that the 4 men who carried that man who was paralyzed to Jesus were his friends. They were concerned for him because he was sick, and they just got together and organized to carry their friend to Jesus so that he could be healed. That makes sense to us as modern readers. Who would do something like that for someone if not a friend? But the Bible doesn't say that they are his friends. In fact, it barely even acknowledges them as human beings. They are introduced using nothing but a pronoun. This is how it reads literally in the original Greek. Then they came, bringing to him a paralyzed man, carried by 4 of them. Who are they? Apparently, we don't need to know. Or maybe the gospel writer is assuming that we should know who they are, and that they don't need to be introduced. You see, we live in a world where it is quite rare to see someone being carried in a litter. I mean, outside of hospitals or when paramedics show up somewhere, it just doesn't happen in our society. And even then, we use wheeled gurneys, which means that it doesn't take 4 burly men to carry the person in the litter. But in the time of Jesus, it was relatively common to see someone carried in a litter. But there was also definitely a certain type who was carried. It was a rich person's mode of transport. In fact, the very idea that someone who was poor, no matter what the state of their health, would travel in that way would have been so unusual that it surely would have been remarked upon. But such a thing is not remarked upon in this passage. What's more, the bed that he lies on is called a krabatos in the Greek. The word is often translated as mat or pallet, but it can refer to any kind of bed, including a fancy couch. Given that the bed the man was lying on was heavy enough to require 4 men to carry it, and sturdy enough to be lowered down from a rooftop, it was probably pretty substantial. And if people in Jesus' time saw such a thing, a rich man carried in a couch by 4 burly men, they would have made an assumption about the men who were doing the carrying, and that assumption would not have been that those 4 men were his friends. So maybe it is time to hear the story of those 4 men. This is Retelling the Bible. Episode 9.23, 4 men and a bed. Jesus had returned to Capernaum, following a quick tour of some of the surrounding villages. Somehow, it had just happened. Simon wasn't sure that anyone had planned it, but Capernaum had just become the center of their little operation. The place they always came back to. Simon didn't mind that. It was his hometown, and he was always happy to come back and see his wife and mother-in-law and children. He also didn't mind acting as a host to Jesus and to some of the other disciples. He was honored to have him stay in his home. The crowds, though, were a different matter. Somehow everyone who lived within a day's journey had also figured out that Capernaum was their home base and had come in droves, looking for healing, wisdom, and hoping to hear some of the teacher's famous stories. The first time it had happened, on the night when Jesus had healed his mother-in-law, and everyone from the town came out to see him, Simon had found it exhilarating. He had stationed himself at the door and taken on the job of bouncer. It gave him a feeling of power, that he was the one who was controlling access to the teacher. He felt he had done a pretty good job. He only let a few people jump the queue because they were old friends or because they offered him favors. But when they came back to Capernaum this time, the crowds were even bigger, and it was starting to get old. There was a long line extending from the door at this point, and people were getting impatient. Some of the more important and prosperous people from the area had shown up and were loudly stating that they shouldn't be made to wait with the rabble. they deserved priority, they insisted. Somehow, Simon didn't feel that Jesus would agree with them, but he was getting tired of being the one to make that call. And so he had just shut the door, fastening it with a jerry-made bolt that he knew very well would not hold for very long should the crowd start pushing on it. But he felt that he had to go in for a few moments and consult with Jesus. Who did he want to see him next? And so it was that Simon had only just entered the main room when he heard digging and scratching from above him. He lifted his eyes just in time for a shower of dust, straw, and clay to fall upon them. Simon blinked and wiped it away furiously. What was going on here? At that moment, a bright light struck him from above, as a piece of the ceiling was removed, allowing the daytime sun to shine through. He looked up again to see somebody's face, looking back at him. The man shrugged, somewhat apologetically, before turning away to speak to somebody. It seemed obvious what was happening here. One of the privileged people waiting outside had decided to find an alternate to passing through the door. Simon was enraged. What kind of person was so full of himself that he was willing to commit vandalism on somebody's house to not have to wait like everybody else? Jacob was a farmer who lived in a town a little to the north of Capernaum. He had done very well for himself over the years, increasing his land holdings. He was aware, of course, that his prosperity had come at the expense of others. He had obtained control of the land of his neighbors by extending credit to them, and then, when they were unable to pay, taking their land. Credit had also proved to be a very effective way of building up a workforce to farm his land holdings. People who were indebted to him often came to the point where they had no choice but to sell themselves to him as indentured laborers. And so his workforce, as well as his wealth, continued to grow. Sometimes he felt bad about how he had profited so much from the losses and miseries of others. He tried not to think about it, distracting himself with sumptuous meals and entertainments. But sometimes, in the quiet of the night, he would think of the people he had dispossessed and enslaved, and wondered if he could ever be forgiven for what they had suffered. Jacob had begun to have trouble with his legs a few seasons ago. It began with a strange numbness in his feet that caused him to take to his bed for long stretches of time. This posed little trouble to someone who had so many slaves, of course. He had several of them construct for him a sturdy couch with 4 handles and short legs. And he then chose 4 of his strongest slaves and gave them the job of carrying him about as he supervised the work on his lands. He hoped that the use of the couch would only be something he needed on the short term. But as time went by, he found himself calling on the bearers more frequently. He became angry and depressed with his physical limitations, and often took out the anger on his slaves. He felt bad about that too, but often also felt as if he could not help himself. Soon he spent all his days on the couch, never rising and wincing in pain at almost any unexpected movement. He did not know what was wrong with his legs, but he began to fear that it might be that he was being punished for his treatment of his neighbors. It was the thought that kept him awake every night, but it was not something that he could share with anybody. He kept it hidden behind a constant need to dominate and show his superiority to everyone that he encountered. And so it was only on the inside that he was miserable. When Jesus returned to Capernaum and showed every sign of staying there for a while, the word spread like wildfire through all of the surrounding villages. It was Jacob's steward, one of the few people who had ever shown much interest in his well-being, who brought the news to him. Jacob had heard about this Jesus from Nazareth, of course, one of what seemed like an endless stream of healers who had become famous for the wonders that they performed. He just assumed him to be another charlatan and trickster. But the steward had apparently seen the man on a previous tour and assured him that this Jesus of Nazareth was the real deal. After listening to him for a while, Jacob decided that it was maybe at least worth checking him out. And so he called for his 4 litter bearers. They were, of course, always near at hand. As soon as they filed in before him, he told them to prepare themselves. First thing in the morning, they would be leaving for Capernaum. They arrived in the town just as the heat of the day was coming on. The wealthy man was well shaded from the sun in his litter, but he was still complaining about how stuffy it was. The bearers, of course, had no such protection from the sun, and had been sweating profusely for the last hour. But they did not complain. Indeed, they had silently endured their master's abuse ever since the sun had risen. Oh, he had many opinions on how quickly they were progressing, and how smoothly they managed to transport him over and around the various obstacles they encountered. Despite all of this, all 4 of them were actually in a better mood than they usually were. They knew where they were going, and they had heard stories about Jesus. News about him spread rapidly through the slave networks. They had long hoped that they might get to meet him some day. Today, it seemed, they would finally get that chance. That is why every insult and slur provoked no reaction in them. They merely smiled at each other whenever they caught their fellow's eye. Once they had arrived near the shore, at the heart of the town, it became quite clear to them where they would find the wonder worker. A large crowd had formed around one particular house, not far from the water. At Jacob's instructions, he was set down. He then instructed one of the bearers to push his way through the crowd and secure their access. And make sure you tell them how important I am, number one, Jacob instructed the man. He had long since fallen into the habit of referring to them by number, not wanting to bother with names. Tell them that I have come a long way, and that my problems are much more important than those of all these other people. Number one returned only a few minutes later to report that the big fisherman on the door had insisted that they would have to wait. Jacob did not take that answer well, but even he recognized that there would be no arguing with the man on the door. He needed to find some way to get himself before the healer. Surely Jesus would understand how important he was. It was at that point that he caught sight of some of the things that the local fishers had left by their boats when they came to shore that morning. He saw piles of ropes and sturdy oars laying around, and a plan began to come together in his mind. It was number 3 who finally broke through the roof of the house. He removed a large piece of clay and peered down into the darkness to see the face of Simon blinking up at him. The fisherman's mood was easy to read on his face. He was clearly not having a good day. Number 3 understood completely, but he could hardly say anything. To apologize for the destruction that they had just caused would have been to admit that their master had acted inappropriately, and he would never accept that. So 3 merely shrugged and turned to give Jacob an update. Jacob responded with an exasperated, "Finally." The rich man had found the entire process had taken far too long. He had constantly grumbled while the 4 rigged the ropes, found a way to climb the building, and then hauled him up. Digging through the roof with the blunt oars also took much more time than he thought it should. But now that they had broken through, it was relatively quick work to make the hole large enough to accommodate the couch. All activity had stopped inside the house, as everyone stared up in wonder at what was happening above them. The room, though quite crowded, fell into complete silence as they slowly and carefully lowered Jacob and his bed into the space that had formed on the floor. Every eye in the room was on Jesus. All were wondering how he would react to this strange intrusion. Many of the people who were there had waited all morning to bring their needs before him. Quite apart from the destruction to the house that he had caused, they were not impressed with the creative way in which Jacob had jumped the queue. So they were not much inclined to view this wealthy man with sympathy. But they had seen that Jesus was a man of great compassion, so perhaps he would react differently. Jacob, for his part, expected that his dramatic entrance would command all of the attention of the healer. But he was dismayed to see that Jesus was not actually looking at him at all. Instead, he was gazing upward, towards the hole in the ceiling, staring at the faces of the 4 smiling men who looked back at him. And then he praised them. Jesus went on and on about how they were faithful, how they were the ones who really got what his message was all about. All of them, numbers 1 through 4, had these goofy grins on their faces as they soaked up all the attention of the teacher. Jacob found it to be quite impertinent. What were they, after all, but mere manual laborers? They were nothing but extensions of the will of their master. If anyone had demonstrated faith on this day, surely it was himself. But no. For quite some time, Jesus behaved as if Jacob didn't even exist. He found it so disturbing that he began to make some noise to attract Jesus' attention back to where it belonged. And then Jesus did finally take notice of him. For a moment at least. He looked down and just said, "Child, your sins are forgiven." The words took Jacob by surprise. The first word, child, was shock enough. He was a gentleman, a leading citizen. He was a very successful businessman who had done well for himself. He was not a child. But Jacob did not really have time to react to the first word, because the rest of what Jesus had said hit him like a ton of bricks. All he could think of was, how did he know? He had presented himself, like everyone else, as someone seeking healing. His physical problem, his obvious paralysis, was clear for anyone to see. And yet, Jesus had not addressed his illness. He had spoken to his sin. He had addressed the guilt that Jacob had carried with him for so many years, but that he had also so carefully hidden from everyone. How had Jesus known? Somehow this healer had seen that there was something at the heart of his soul that was weighing him down, a paralysis of the heart that he had long feared was his biggest problem. Somehow, Jacob felt sure that Jesus knew all of it. The things that he had taken from his neighbors, the ways that he had fed on them and their families, and the ways that he had used them. And yet Jesus had also granted him forgiveness for all of it. Jacob realized that he had been granted what he had truly come looking for. And with that realization, he felt the tears come to his eyes. He did not wonder why Jesus had done this for him, did not even ask how he had the authority to do such a thing, though apparently there were some present who were wondering that very thing. They were busy arguing with him over that question. But all of those discussions were taking place at the very edges of Jacob's awareness. He simply lay there in wonder, trying to come to terms with the possibility that he could be forgiven. If he was indeed released from all of his misdeeds, all of the ways in which he had mistreated his neighbors, then maybe he could find some way to start all over again. Eventually, the discussion that Jesus was having with some of the bystanders lost steam. None of them seemed to have been convinced by any of his arguments, and they were getting nowhere. And so Jesus finally turned his attention back to Jacob, where he lay, a weeping puddle, on his couch. As he spoke to him this time, Jacob could hear the empathy in his voice. "I say to you, stand up, take your mat, and go to your home." It was the oddest thing. Just minutes ago, when he was lying up there on the rooftop, waiting impatiently while 1, 2, 3, and 4 dug their way through the clay and straw, Jacob would have been completely insulted by the very thought that he should pick up his own bed. He would have reacted with fury if anyone even suggested that he could debase himself by performing such manual labor. But now, he felt lighter than he had in many years. A true weight had been lifted from his heart, and he suddenly had respect for the work that the 4 had done for him over the years. It did not seem a dishonor to be asked to do it. And, what is more, in the strange lightness of heart that he had found, he thought that perhaps he actually could do it. And then he did. The cheering and laughter that came from the four men looking down through the hole in the ceiling echoed through the room and quickly spread to everyone else. Even Jacob found himself smiling. I have been reading a book lately, written by Candida Moss. It is called God's Ghostwriters, Enslaved Christians and the Making of the Bible. Her thesis is that enslaved people were much more involved in the creation, transmission, and preservation of the New Testament than we realize. It is a fascinating book, and I will admit that it has blown my mind several times as I read it. I do highly recommend it. And one particular point she often makes is that we need to be more aware of the perspective of the enslaved people on the stories and teaching that they were involved in writing. One of the examples she gives is the story of the healing of the paralyzed man at Capernaum. And so I would like to acknowledge that this particular episode was inspired by her extraordinary work. In particular, she is the one who taught me that the four bearers were almost certainly slaves, and that the couch was likely pretty substantial. As for Jacob and what was wrong with him, I don't know. Was his paralysis in his mind, in his spirit, or in his body? Was it perhaps in all three? Who can say? But I do know that a bit of forgiveness can go a long way towards opening up new possibilities for anyone. That is it for this episode of Retelling the Bible. Thanks for listening, and do share the word. Go tell somebody else about this podcast. The theme music for the podcast is Ada by Kevin MacLeod, and the mood music for this episode was Rooftop Solitude by Sasha End. The music is licensed in the Creative Commons and can be found at incompetech.com and at nd.app, respectively. You can contact me on Bluesky at Retelling the Bible and on the Facebook page Retelling the Bible. Show notes have been posted at retellingthebible.wordpress.com. Thanks to my supporters on Patreon. Your support means everything to me. Go to patreon.com/retellingthebible to join them in supporting this podcast. This is Retelling the Bible, and I have been your storyteller, W. Scott McCandless.